Welcome to this edition of Under the Radar for Saturday, February 18th. And because it's been topical in the last few days, we're going to have a look at a couple of stories from different parts of the world that involve the so-called religion of peace. So first, Ayaan Hirsi Ali has penned a response to the absurd claims of the now notorious Yasmin Abdel-Magid, specifically the claim that sexist practices in majority Muslim countries are the result of culture, not religion or Sharia. Quote, "Contrary to the claims of Abdel-Magid, the problematic tenets of Sharia are not some relic left over from the cultural practices of the 7th century. Today, Sharia law is applied in many countries as a matter of reality and is also enforced in many Muslim communities in matters such as marriage, divorce, custody, and inheritance proceedings. Indeed, the countries Abdel-Magid visited are proud to call their legal code Sharia law. Saudi Arabia's basic law states the regime derives its power from the Holy Quran and the Prophet's Sunnah, which rule over this and all other state laws, all within the framework of the Sharia. Likewise, Kuwait's constitution declares that Islamic law shall be a main source of legislation. Sudan's interim 2005 constitution states, nationally enacted legislation having effect only in respect of the northern states of the Sudan shall have as its sources of legislation Islamic Sharia and the consensus of the people. Qatar's constitution requires the ruler to swear by God the Great and to respect the Islamic law. Egypt's 2014 constitution holds the principles of Islamic Sharia are the principal source of legislation. In Iran, the marriage of girls at a young age is permitted based on Muhammad's consummation of his marriage to Aisha when she was 9. It is therefore plainly false to say, as Abdel-Magid does, that the subjection of women in these countries is not down to Sharia, but down to the culture and the patriarchy and the politics of those countries. And that's why, as Hirsi Ali goes on to point out, Abdel-Magid and the Islamist collective that is demanding an apology from the ABC are not interested in this kind of inconvenient truth. They want to deflect attention away from the problems inherent in Sharia law. In my view, the Australian government should stop funding people such as Abdel-Magid and the other partners they have, and instead find progressive, reform-minded Muslims who will help with the vital task of assimilating Muslims into Australian society." Absolutely. And Australians are rightfully outraged at the funding of this type of obscurantist like Magid. At this point, she's basically the Reza Aslan of Australia. Now, I recommend you read the full article, but it is behind a paywall and it hasn't shown up on her page over at the Hoover Institution yet, but perhaps it might in the near future, so keep a lookout for it. Now, you're probably aware of the phenomenon of young, mostly Muslim men leaving Western countries to go and fight with ISIS or some other terrorist organisation in the Middle East. But you may not be aware of the amount of women leaving their comfortable lives to support the cause. Islamic State luring Australian women to breed more jihadi fighters. Islamic State is luring Australian women using a warped version of feminism. Is there any other kind? When the reality is they're being targeted to breed jihadi fighters, a report says. Counterterrorism expert Sophia Patel from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute says a surprising number of Western women, about 550, have travelled to Syria and Iraq to join the fight. In a special report, she writes that IS propaganda shows women as empowered, but the reality is they end up in a misogynistic world, forced to stay home to cook, clean, and breed. IS has portrayed women's involvement in its mission under the guise of female empowerment and liberation, she writes. The roles and responsibilities it promises women on social media and via its propaganda are interlaced with notions of divine responsibility and duty, the promise of liberation, and an idealised utopian existence in the caliphate. However, that is vastly different from the reality of life in the caliphate. IS really sees women's worth as predominantly to maintain the numbers of male mujahideen. That women are rarely allowed to fight or take up professional roles is reflected in the IS magazine Dabiq. My Muslim sister, indeed you are a mujahidah, fighter. And if the weapon of the man is the assault rifle and the explosive belt, then know that the weapon of the woman is good behaviour and knowledge. Well, that sounds empowering. And if you're a lady, let us know in the comments how attractive you think that sounds to you. Now, of course, the liberal left media would have you believe that what drives Muslims in Western countries to do this is because of the rampant Islamophobia, and that we don't do enough to make Muslims feel welcome in our societies. So with that in mind, let's turn to the next story from the UK. Ilford father Faisal Bashir, who claims he was forced to move house after renouncing Islam, is calling for more action on hate crime. Now, if you don't know, Ilford is in East London. A man who claims he was forced to move house after renouncing his faith wants authorities to crack down on hate crime. Faisal Bashir decided to stop practicing Islam in the summer of 2014 over claims the religion was too hateful and sending out the wrong message. But when the 43-year-old stopped going to mosques in Ilford, he claims he started getting harassment on a weekly basis. The father of two said, "I heard religious people say things I couldn't put up with any longer. It was all too hateful. These people knew I had become an atheist, and soon enough my whole family was being harassed. At least once a week they would hang around near my house, shouting and swearing at me. I was called an apostate, a non-believer. I was told I had betrayed my God and my faith. Sometimes they would even say things to my children, when they are far too little to know what was happening. They were very frightened." Mr. Bashir claims he would often call the police, but was told it was just a nuisance and was not a police matter until it was reported at least twice a month. He said, "They always said they couldn't really do anything because no physical altercation ever took place, but I'm not the kind of person to get violent with anybody. Also, it was always different people, so they claimed they couldn't log it as a similar complaint. Eventually, a police officer told me I should just move house to get away from it all." Now, I think you'll agree there is a massive double standard at work here. Post the Brexit vote, there was a concerted campaign by the UK government to encourage people to report hate crimes, which then became a self-fulfilling prophecy. But you see, hate crimes are not for people like Mr. Bashir. They're for minorities. And now that he's not a Muslim, he's not a protected identity group. And this didn't start in 2016. Here's Brendan O'Neill talking about an experience he had in 2014.
You have this kind of Islamophobia industry. You know, I was in a toilet in a pub recently, and there was a poster on the wall which said, "Are you a Muslim? Have you suffered abuse? Has anyone ever said anything bad to you? If so, phone this number." So they're actively trawling for evidence of Islamophobia. But in relation to anti-Semitism, the response has been much more muted. People don't want to talk about it. So I think the Islamophobia thing is now part of the multiculturalism industry. It's about making people feel like they are victims, that society is out to get them. And that fuels this quite backward political outlook.
Now, as I said, the liberal media is consistently telling us that it's our fault, that we are Islamophobic and we're not welcoming enough to Muslims. Well, I want to play you a clip from a radio show back in January when Australian journalist Miranda Devine interviewed psychiatrist Tanveer Ahmed, author of Fragile Nation, who was raised a Muslim and has studied in his own practice this general phenomenon of Muslims rebelling against Western culture.
Remember, the devil in Islam is really the great tempter, right? So there's this kind of real self-loathing that happens. We talk about self-loathing at the left, but there's also a self-loathing amongst Muslims who feel attracted and would like to participate in Western freedoms, but aren't allowed to because either of their religion or their social communities. And then often their version of a backlash is this religiosity, saying, well, okay, stuff you, I'm religious. And then they develop all these anti-ideas, all these oppositional ideas that they're racist, they discriminate us. And one of the themes I put in my book, it's actually a type of projection. What happens is many Muslims actually self-segregate first. They will self-segregate first, but then flip it and say, oh, actually, no, you're the ones who are racist and discriminate. Now, the other interesting point that I haven't heard made in public, a lot of the points that, say, Muslims in public make, they're really discrete ways of showing opposition to society at large. And I'll explain what I mean. For example, it's very hard to, after, say, September 11th and America attacked Afghanistan, it's very hard to openly say, I'm opposed to the war in Afghanistan. But that'll be changed to, I don't approve of using drones. Likewise, it's very hard to outwardly proclaim your hatred to Israel while living in the West. But that will be changed to, well, Palestinian lives are worth less than Israeli lives. And likewise, the kind of perpetual accusations of racism, discrimination. Underneath that really is a way of saying, expressing an ambivalence to the society at large. Because you can't openly sort of say, oh, I'm ambivalent about Western values. But the way it's often expressed is, oh, you're racist and you discriminate against us. So a lot of what you hear from Muslims, and certainly not well identified in the mainstream press, are discrete ways of expressing opposition and ambivalence to Western society.
And so there you have it. Muslims often self-segregate first, and the Australian public aren't stupid. They know this. They know they live in an extremely open and tolerant society. So when they get lectured by leftist elites about how racist, sexist and Islamophobic they are, they quite rightly call bullshit. And when Pauline Hanson and Jackie Lambie types speak out, even if it isn't in the most articulate manner, they gain a lot of support because Australians aren't hearing that point of view expressed in the mainstream media. Quite the opposite. So in light of the themes in this week's Under the Radar, I thought it would be appropriate to end with a brief speech that Nigel Farage gave to the European Parliament on Tuesday.
For the group of Europe Freedom and Direct Democracy, Mr. Farage.
I feel like I'm attending a meeting of a religious sect here this morning. It's as if the global revolution of 2016, Brexit, Trump, the Italian rejection in the referendum has completely bypassed you. You can't face up to the fact that this bandwagon is going to roll across Europe in these elections in 2017. A lot of citizens now recognise this form of centralised government simply doesn't work. Whether it's the miseries inflicted upon a country like Greece by the euro, the unemployment caused by bad regulation, or the feeling that none of us are as safe in our cities because of the disastrous common asylum policy. But at the heart of it is a fundamental point. Mr Verhofstadt this morning said the people want more Europe. They don't. The people want less Europe. And we see this again and again when people have referendums and they reject aspects of EU membership. But something more fundamental is going on out there. Yes, you can say they're lying, and I've no doubt that many of you here, when you hear what I'm about to say, will probably despise your own voters. Because just last week, Chatham House, the reputable group, published a massive survey from 10 European member states, and only 20% of people want immigration from Muslim countries to continue. Just 20% want us to keep on allowing people in from Muslim countries, which means your voters have a harder line position on this than Donald Trump or myself or frankly any party sitting in this parliament. And that is where we're going. And I simply cannot believe that you're blind to the fact that even Mrs Merkel has now made a U-turn and wants to send people back. Even Mr Schulz thinks that it's a good idea. The fact is, the European Union has no future at all in its current form, and I suspect you're in for as big a shock in 2017 as you were in 2016.
Remember, if you have any suggestions for next week's Under the Radar, drop them in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, or even consider a donation via Patreon. See you next time.